Good morning. I even got a response. That's awesome. Most of you are awake after the festivities of last night. Fantastic. Hello. I just wanted to say hello formally. I'm really, really excited to be here at DevConf. This is my first time speaking in Poland, but not my first time in Poland. I work for a fantastic company called VML, and we actually have an office here with 30 or 40 developers. So it was exciting for me to both visit my office last time and now finally speak in front of you. Thank you all for coming. I'm assuming most of you in the audience have heard of at least one of these two, yes? Yeah? Great. How many of you have actually played with one of these two? Any? Okay, a couple of you. All right, how many of you have actually played with Google Assistant? Yeah. But you know why? Because for many of us, we first did it on our phone. Fun fact, the very first voice interaction that was done was with Google. It was not Siri. So this is actually something that's been around for a while from that company. And how many of you have messed around with Alexa? A couple? Good. Wonderful. It expanded quite a bit this past year into Europe, and other countries just came to Australia about a month ago. So it's a very exciting time. All right. So what we're really here to talk about are these two guys, right? There are many, many, many different kinds of natural language processing bots that are out there. But these are by far the most popular, and I probably don't need to tell you that since you all graced me with your presence today. But what you probably didn't know is that by 2021, more than 50% of the companies around the world will spend more annually on these kinds of bots than traditional mobile apps. That's not just around the corner, but it's pretty close. So this is the reason that I wanted to start talking to you about this. I've done mobile apps for years, and I've spent a good amount of time in the .NET space. So I got really excited when I started seeing this explosive growth, and I believed that every developer should at least have some sort of voice AI development in their toolkit, because it's not going to go away, and it's only going to grow. But as I started down this path, I bought myself a couple of these. This right here, for those of you who don't know, is an Echo Dot, which is a small version of Amazon's Echo. And this right here is a Google Home Mini. Very easy for me to travel with. They have gone around the world with me. And unfortunately, this guy got a little marred on the plane the other day, so I unplugged him so he doesn't decide to start talking randomly during my presentation. But we'll go into it a little bit more about ease of travel as well. Most of these are designed to be just in your home or in your office or in one stationary location. However, if you look on YouTube, there's all sorts of different locations that these are being used in. Even most recently, airports are starting to put them in to assist travelers instead of trying to find the one lone person at a desk that can direct you. You can just ask one of these kinds of ecosystems where to go and how to get to your gate, for example. So now that I've intrigued you a little bit, I wanted to kind of take you on my journey as to what kind of questions I had. Because I've done traditional web development and service development, API development for years. So what kind of transition did I need to go through? I had some questions. My questions were, how does a skill even work? Where do we program it? What concepts should I know? How does the debugging process even go? How do I make a basic skill just with a service instead of something that is fed as a hard-coded kind of a thing? Can it even take dynamic user input? I wanted to know about expressiveness. I mean, is there any personality I could give these voice AIs? I wanted to know, can these responses be updated by someone who is not me? Because I don't know about you, I love job security, but not at 2 a.m. So I would like someone else to be able to change and update the things that are said. I wanted to know if I could change the responses completely based on what the users have said. I wanted to know if every response has to be tracked and scripted and matched. And I wanted to know what we have to keep in mind as voice developers. Right? So for the rest of today, you're all voice developers, and I'm going to refer to you as such. So let's start with the first question. How does a skill even work? A few of you said that you have played around at least with, I'm assuming, owning one of these devices, but how many of you in here have actually made a voice skill? Anybody? Yeah, a couple of people. You guys are ahead of the curve. This time next year, it'll be much more commonplace. The way that this works and the way that you need to think about it is that you have just a basic interaction device. This is called a device in terms of what Amazon says, and for Google Assistant, they call them surfaces. The great thing about Google is that you can have an additional surface that Amazon doesn't offer, because Google has Android phones that can also utilize a Google Assistant skill. Obviously, Amazon doesn't have a phone. They do have a Kindle Fire tablet that can work with it, but it's by far not very popular. So when it comes to portability, it seems to only really go to Google's favor. So over the time, Amazon has decided to release a mobile app that also allows you to interact with Alexa as of this year. So that's what I mean by our device or our service. Next, what you need to understand is that this is not a presentation about how to do natural language processing, because Amazon and Google have done that for us. Now, can you build your own NLP interface? Absolutely. There is a GitHub repo for everything. You can do all sorts of things with it. But why would you when so many of the users are already a part of these ecosystems? Just keep that in mind. And the reason why we want to be part of this ecosystem is leveraging existing capabilities. For example, on Amazon's side, they're very well known as a purveyor of goods, a service that you can purchase from, right? Well, the reason that I would, as a developer or maybe as a company, want to be in their ecosystem is so that maybe I can automatically populate their shopping cart with some of my products, right? And I could do that to be helpful to the user, to have ease to the user. And the same thing goes with Google. Like, Google has so many additional capabilities, it's kind of hard to name them all, that can be directly connected with what I'm doing. So this is the reason why I decided to go into this, specifically because I work for an advertising company, and we want to be able to reach as many customers as possible. This is kind of what the interaction looks like at a very basic level. You know, a user asks a question, it goes through a device into the cloud, and then to whatever database or service that you have, and then that returns. It's pretty simple. Yes, for those of you who don't know, nothing is really stored here. Like, there is no big, huge database here. There's a very small one that allows the mic to listen and pick up when the user is prompting, but it's not very strong. What is strong are the microphones that are set up in these devices, are very good so that you can be across the room. In my case, I've been in my kitchen and be able to continue to interact. But everything happens in the cloud. Any questions? Are we good? Awesome. It looks very similar for Google Assistant. The only addition is it goes through something called an action. So a Google action can be created to interact with one of Google's services, and it doesn't have to be with Google Assistant. It can be with any one of Google's other services as well. So everything is kind of boxed in to something called an action. So when we think about this, you kind of have to go through that first, and then it goes through the invocation. So invocation meaning something that wakes up the device and allows it to respond with fulfillment. Okay? This is a kind of a basic diagram of what it would look like for a smart home skill. This is an example of Alexa, but it actually holds true as well for Google. The difference here is that I'm talking to the device, but I don't require a response. I don't need a verbal response. All I need is for an action to take place. In this case, I want to turn on the kitchen light, and then the light turns on. Okay? This is one of the very first reasons that these two companies even decided to go into the home space, so that you can get things done without any sort of retort. You just wanted to get like a light turned on. if you wanted to, and you're not really that interested in coding hardcore with this, I've done a lot of different kinds of projects with kids where they've used if this then that. Has anybody here used that before? If this and that? It's really fun. It's really fun if you want to just kind of connect what things should happen in what order with like blocks, and instead of doing really hardcore coding. It's pretty easy to do some sort of a voice command that goes through the device, out the internet, going through that service, and then allows maybe your Roomba to turn on. Or in my case, I am a big fan of drones. And a couple of the drones allow you to hit an API and control them. So I personally enjoyed doing a workshop with a bunch of kids where we decided to use the force and make our drones wake up just with our voice. It was very fun. So this is kind of a good way to play around without committing directly to the coding process. But this is a developer conference, right? We love code. Yes? Yes. Let's get to it. So what does this look like? This is kind of the basic back and forth conversation. And the reason I'm going over this is that it becomes important to know where you can change things, right? If the customer says something, Alexa has to identify what the request is, which skill it goes to. It has to understand their accents or any sort of ways of speaking. And that right there takes out a huge chunk of work for us. So we don't have to spend a lot of time on voice analysis. Okay. Then all it does is it knocks on our API door and say, hey, you got a request? Here you go. Kind of like the mail person. Yeah? Yes. And then your skill gets to assemble whatever kind of response you want in two forms. So you see up here, we've got a voice response. Okay? If you notice, there's another one down below. Alexa and Google both allow you to give a visual response. It's optional. It's not necessary, but it's really good for recollection. Anytime that you want, maybe let's say you told a user someplace to go, like this is the location of this building you need to go to. It'd be helpful if you sent this to their phone as kind of a reminder or a summary of the conversation, right? So because of that, it allows you to kind of formulate two different kinds of JSON responses. This is what it kind of looks like for Google Assistant. Very similar, right? So over there, you see that they're starting to talk back and forth. This is great, but it can be a little cumbersome on Google's side, strangely enough, because this used to be a process that was using their conversational API. That's used for many things. It could be a little cumbersome to put together. So they decided to add a component to this called Dialogflow. It used to be called API.ai. Okay? The purpose is state management and the ability to script a back and forth conversation. So, that sounds pretty fantastic. Where do I program it? I have all these questions. I keep getting told and promised that this is going to be easy. I promise you. Well, let me give you a disclaimer right now. I don't work for either of these companies. I've worked with their products. Okay? So I was in this wonderful third-party place where I can kind of give you a real sense of the kind of work it took. So the first one I started with was the Alexa voice service. Has anybody used AVS before? No? Okay, one guy. Awesome. Basically what happens here is you can stream audio directly to their API, and then it still does the processing for you. Okay? That means you're responsible for the device as well. So maybe you want to be able to talk to Alexa without having one of the Echo devices. You can do that, right? If you notice down at the bottom, that is Google Assistant, right? The conversational API. That just kind of gives the same kind of a thing wrapped up in an action. Are you confused yet? Am I confused yet? That's a lot of stuff. I just want them to do the same thing because we all learned our lesson from mobile, right? You can't just support one. You got to support both. That's the way it goes. So now that we learned this lesson and we know that we probably have to support both of these, I was wondering why they were so different. Like certain things were the same, but like the names were different. Like why can't they just call them devices? Why does one have to be a surface? I don't understand why things have to be so unique. Right? I wanted a template. I just wanted to do a basic skill. right? Show me how to do just a basic one. Now remember, I've got years of development experience, and I was starting to find this whole thing a little confusing. Luckily for us, they came to the rescue, and they gave us templatized approaches as developers. Okay? This next one that I'm going to talk to you about is Alexa Skills Kit and the Dialogflow, which used to be API.ai. Okay? Those two things allow you to kind of do a real basic skill with very minimal interaction and coding if you want. Okay? I'm very grateful for this process because most skills fall into this bucket. When it comes to how much you can leverage it, these are only going to be for these devices. They're not going to be, for instance, something that you can call out to and put inside of your car. But you could do that with like the voice service or the conversation API, right? Which I've done before, and it's really fun to do, especially in like a VR game or an AR game. That's really fun to pipe that in and directly talk to Google or Alexa through it. That's fun. But for most people, they just want it to go directly to these proprietary devices, okay? So this is where you want to start to make it a little bit easier, okay? So let's take a look at what the portal looks like, at least for each one of these. This first one is your Alexa Developer Portal. It has undergone many changes, and because this is a rapidly evolving space, this changes about every month. So right now, this is what this looks like. It's actually gotten easier over the years. I kind of like that it gives you an overview of how many built-in intents you have and custom intents and slot types right there. It's really nice. But one I found to be even easier was Dialogflow's interface. It was very fresh, it was very direct, very easy for me to see. Not necessarily as pretty looking, but it definitely was straightforward. The only problem was I had no idea what everything was on the left-hand side. So they literally dump you in here and say, get going. So after a little bit of messing around, I discovered something. Dialogflow is an extra layer. Yes, it can templatize the Google Assistant approach, but it can also manage the what kinds of questions, or in this case, we call them intents, you have. And I'm like, well, can I use that? Can I use Dialogflow to manage both of these? Right? That's a good question. Because right now I can just imagine duplicating my efforts, right, for each one, which you have to do to a point with mobile apps, right? You have to give a different, at least, user interface feel. So I said, but how much can we share? So I looked into what Dialogflow really does and what it can do. And I found they've got all sorts of different integrations. Really fantastic. I mean, I can even do Skype with it if I wanted to. I can make all sorts of bots with Twilio and Twitter. And I just noticed down at the bottom, though, there was something that didn't have a nice little slider button. Because they don't want you to have a direct integration with Amazon, who is their competitor. Instead, they say you have to export the back and forth intent conversation every time you make a change, and then you can put it up in Amazon's portal. I'm like, that's a little cumbersome. I don't really like that. That's kind of awkward. Over time, everything gets better. But I thought, how can I manage two of these? Really, it kind of came down to how much power and control can we have as developers into making this streamlined. I really wanted to understand what concepts I needed to know. Okay? So, let's start out with philosophy. Good topic, right? Remember, I'm a developer. Most of you probably are as well. I'm not a designer. I'm not the ideator. I like to execute on ideas, right? However, right now, you are going to play many roles in the beginning because probably nobody at your company has ever done this before, right? So as I was watching a little bit about what it takes to make a good voice skill, I stumbled across an excellent video from Google I/O 2017 by James Giangallo. And he talked about 4 very important things. Grice's maxims. Has anybody heard of this concept before? Oh, good. I've got fresh people. So the idea is Grice's very simple, but as always, the execution can be a little bit more work. Because in order for us to give users something that is simple for them, that means we get to do a lot of the complex work, right? So because of that, there were 4 things that if you can stick to it, tend to go really well for you, at least in the process of doing voice skills. You have to focus on being truthful with your users, especially when you're speaking to them. Be brief in your responses. Please be relevant to the conversation and be very clear. If you can master these 4 things in your skill, you will have a winning voice skill every single time. And I can tell you, after doing dozens of voice skills, this does ring true. So if you can look it up, I mean, there isn't a whole lot more to it than that, because I like simplicity. So here it is for you. I've saved you about 80 pages of reading. Here you go. I'm going to introduce you to another concept that I stumbled across that I didn't think about. So as we're building, we have to think about what kind of responses we're going to give. One of those responses needs to be cooperative. Has anyone heard of the cooperative principle before? Huh? Nope? Awesome. It kind of goes like this. We're used to something on the left, right? You set an alarm, a user would say, I want to set an alarm, and the UI might respond, okay, what time? And the user would respond with the time and say, great, you're done. You have officially done your job as a user and adhered to everything I wanted, right? But a cooperative path, you might get piecemealed information, especially when it comes to voice. If you don't have a screen in front of you, all of our minds start wandering. We start tying our shoe. We start cooking something on the stove. We might be having a conversation with someone else while we're having a conversation with our assistant, right? So the way you build this has to fundamentally shift. That means everything, if you think about a function, right, and you're taking in multiple parameters, that means every function may have none of the parameters fulfilled, one of the parameters fulfilled, 2 out of 3. You never know. That means you have to kind of shift the way you think about a conversation with the user, which is not something that you're used to when you can at least shove a bunch of options in front of a user, right? So remember, this is blind for them. They have no idea what the options are, so they're going to say whatever they want. A more cooperative way to think about this is to have a conversation like this one. Set an alarm. Okay, that's just what I want done. I didn't give you any information other than the fact that I want something to happen, okay? And the UI can respond a little bit more friendly and say, hey, what time? Which is very similar to what we had in the happy path, right? But then you can kind of prompt the next thing. You remember conversations like this maybe with your parents as you're growing up, right? You give one-word answers. How was school? Fine. Like, what'd you do today? School. I mean, so you get these one-word responses from your kids until finally you're like, no, I just want you to tell me like about your day in like a big sentence. And that's what we want from our users, but that's not reality. So instead of being frustrated that they're just not following all the rules, we need to be cooperative when we interact with them, especially when they have no visual cues to know what kind of prompts need to happen. Okay? That leads me to the next kind of concept, which is conversational implicature. Okay? This first came up when it comes to how come this thing doesn't feel natural to me. I get asked all the time by some of our project managers and some of our clients, like, how do I just make it feel like it's your buddy and you just want to talk to it? And we want to really like make it natural. What does natural mean? Years and years have gone into the sound of the tone of voice that these have, right? A lot of data has gone into that. So I'm not going to go into how they sound. I'm going to go into what they know, which, depending on who you are, can be convenient or scary. In the information age, we know a lot about our users inherently, and sometimes that freaks them out, but sometimes it's a really good thing. I love that I came to Poland and I just said, I want to go to a restaurant. I wasn't specific about my city or whatever, but because it could see my location, it just gave me a list of restaurants in Krakow. That's pretty awesome. I didn't even think about the fact that, it must be tracking me and where I'm at. I don't think about that. I think about, great, this is where I want to go, and I move on. But we don't have that in voice. Why don't we have that in voice? I'll tell you why. Because of this right here. A conversation between real people might go like this. Jacob says, I really need a drink. And Todd responds, well, have you been to the Scotsman? This is actually a real conversation that happened in Oslo last year between two friends of mine. And as I was sitting there watching them, I went, what if one of those was a voice bot? So how would that actually go? Because very little information was really fed by the user, which would be Jacob, right? What is happening here is a lot is being implied, right? What's being implied is that the Scotsman serves drinks, right? So he didn't ask it to filter. He didn't ask 20 questions about what he wanted. He just gave a response because he knew the user, in this case, his friend. But this response also implies that the drinks are alcoholic. Because when someone says, I really need a drink, it's not usually water. Right? It could be, but not usually. Right? And here you guys have excellent alcohol. So, that's usually a safe response, right? It also implies that it's open for business. Right? It also implies that it's nearby, because why would Todd respond with something that's in Timbuktu? Wouldn't make any sense, right? And it also could imply that it's someplace a third party who's standing there, who said nothing this entire time, but was visually available to Todd, might like. That's a lot to imply. As a developer, I look at that and I go, oh man, that's a lot. That means I'd have to already know a lot about you, and I'd have to understand your habits, and that seems like a lot of work. But this is completely possible, especially if you already have an ecosystem with your user. For example, in the States, I don't know if you guys have them here too, but there is a pizza company called Domino's, and they knew their users pretty well. So they didn't want to ask 20 questions when a user asked Google to ask Domino's to give them a pizza, right? They already knew because they had an account on their website that saved their credit card information. They already knew where they lived. So all that happened is that they did an initial connection when they first opened the skill the first time that allowed enough data to be connected that all they really needed to know is, do you want your usual? Because they have a saved preference. And you can say yes, and they're like, great, it'll be there in 15 minutes. That's the extent of the interaction. That's pretty cool. The first time I did that, I was like, I know how this works, but it's still pretty sleek. Now it feels like I really have a Jarvis, taking care of things for me. I don't have to answer back and forth. Do you want, what topping would you like? Say help for a list of options. None of that. It was just, do you want your usual one? If the answer was no, they're like, okay, great, what do you want? I could say, I want a pepperoni pizza. I could have said, I want a pizza. They say, okay, well, do you want, one of our specials or what? It could have been 20 questions, but it wasn't, because the average person has habits. Use them. And if you do that with voice, the adoption rate soars, because then your users feel like they're understood. Even though we all know that this is not magic, none of this is magic, but to a user, if they don't have to have an exhaustive conversation with an automated system, kind of like when you call on the phone to an airline, if they can just not have that back and forth that takes 20 minutes, that saves them so much time and emotional anxiety. So every time I go into a new layer of technology, I find out another layer of humanity. So let's talk about some of the jargon that I've thrown at you for the past 10 minutes or so. Intense. Not like intense, like things are intense, although right now that is an intense light. But this is something that you can think of as an event. Just an event that fires, okay? This is, I intend for something to be fulfilled with this request. That's an intent, okay? Kind of looks a little bit like this, and this was updated very recently, so this is a brand new slide for all of you. If you notice, there is a little intense bracket, and this is an example of some JSON from Alexa, okay? But it looks very similar for Google Assistant as well. What I wanted to point out is that this kind of encodes the intention of the interaction, okay? So that's all I wanted you to take away from that. The next one is sample utterances, okay? They're basically many versions of a way you can say something to get to that intention, right? It's a one-to-many relationship. How many ways can you say what time is it? Many different ways. But really, all you want to know is what is the current time, and that is the intention. I also think about it as my function, but it's just your intent, and that is the way both of these platforms are coded. Invocation name basically is the way you wake up the way that you indicate to Alexa or Google Assistant that you want to talk to this skill, the one you're building. It doesn't have to match the name of it. It just has to be the thing you say, right? So your skill name could be this long, which is possible in many different languages to be this long. But what you say might be much shorter in order to match to it, right? Right now, because it is still in like the earlier age, just like web addresses, right now we don't have parked domains for the whole world. It's usually per region. So whoever got there first with some sort of a name, they got there and they can use it, okay? And both of these companies help you out with finding the right kind of invocation name for you if you can't seem to find one that doesn't already exist. So that's really nice. Another concept that I want you to know is endpoint or fulfillment. None of this is rocket science, of course, but they both mean the same things. Endpoint is for what Amazon calls it, and Google calls it fulfillment, because why would we name things the same? So that's what we got here. Basically, that is what forms a response to the voice assistant request that you need to plug into their portals, okay? You following me now? We're good? Cool. All right. This is what an endpoint might look like for Alexa, okay? There's a couple of different ways you could do it. You notice at the top, there's like a little recommended in brackets right there, because of course, they would love for you to use AWS Lambda to do that instead, right? They would love for you to use a Lambda function. Now, you can do whatever you want, though. I'm a .NET developer. I like Azure. I don't really want to use AWS. There's nothing wrong with either, but I just happen to choose this for two reasons. For me, I decided that because so many of my clients already had services that were built in .NET, I just wanted to extend them, okay? I would like to not have everything piecemealed all over the place. So I decided I'll just give you an endpoint, and this is kind of how you would put it together. If you were to scroll down on that portal, there's different continents as well, so you can decide to optimize based on location as well. This is what it kind of looks like for Google Assistant. Just under the webhook section of fulfillment, and you can also additionally add special headers and basic auth right there if you prefer. What is kind of cool is that if you're interested in like an all-in-one kind of experience, you can also use our inline editor. Because has anybody here used Firebase before for anything? No? Yeah, a couple. Okay. It actually has it built into the Dialogflow portal. So it's kind of cool. If you don't have anything already, this allows you to kind of write a function in line. All right? All right. I think I got through all of that. And that, which I just showed you, of course, is the portal configuration. All that really happens there is it allows you to publish something or not, and allows you optionally to include a templated conversation without hosting. All right? Cool. If you're interested in documentation, here's the one for Alexa, and here's the one for Google. Yes, it is in the Actions section in order for you to get to Google Assistant, but that's because a Google Assistant skill is an action. So let's talk about debugging and testing, all right? So when I first got these, I didn't really read directions when I first start things. I just play around. I've learned since then that's not always the case, and you should probably at least read the manual when you start. But at first, I just plugged it into my laptop, nothing happened. So I discovered that there is no way to locally debug these things. Like, I can't just write a skill and have it work here. I have to have it be somewhere that can be accessed by these ecosystems via the internet. Now, you can open up your own computer, of course, if you want to do that. I just decided, well, this is a good point in time where I can do continuous integration immediately, like right off the bat, right? Let's set that up. All right, so my DevOps cycle started, and I decided because I chose to host this on Azure, I have an option as a .NET developer. I can do remote debugging. Woohoo! So I hardly ever used this feature before, but I had no choice in this case if I ever wanted to catch things mid-flight as they were being processed, as they were being thrown over the wall from Amazon or Google. I needed to be able to catch them as they were happening. So this is what I did. I just enabled remote debugging and pushed a good build out there that had my symbols. Okay? Then I was able to step through and see what was sent over as it was happening. And here's the next page for that. In case you want, there's many, many different blog posts about how to do this, but I just thought I would show you what it would look like. All right, which brings us to kind of what it would look like to test your skill. Okay? What I liked about both of these portals is that they give you an option to test right in the browser. So if you don't have access to one of these devices, even though right now I think they cost right around 200 zloty each, if you don't have one, you can totally do the entire process in the browser. But just like mobile, it's best if you have a device. All right, so this is kind of, let's see if I actually set this up correctly. Yes, and this is exactly what it would look like in the Google Assistant browser to do the same thing. If you notice up the top, it says, see how it works in Google Assistant, and then it allows you to go off into a new portal window that lets you either type or you can enable the microphone on your computer and talk directly to it. Okay? And then what's great about both of these, if you notice, is it gives you what the request and response are in JSON. It gives you logs. It gives you any errors that happen. And of course, this is Google, so it's a little bit more robust of information, but you still get your basic request and response objects on Alexa as well. All right, so how to make a basic skill with this service. Now I'm like, wow, I've got so much more to do. I just figured out how to do a basic test. That's a lot. This is all I did to get started. I decided that I wanted to build something that was a basic demo. So this is a web API, if any of you are familiar with that, basic web API project in .NET. And I put them to different endpoints within the same service. And this is for two reasons. When you submit your skill to be published, they test whether or not anything else can hit your endpoint. That means that you can't do that. You can't give the same endpoint to both. So this is how I got around it. Isn't that sophisticated? But it worked really well for me. Okay? And the reason I made that a dynamic object right there is because I was like, I don't know which version is happening right now. I just wanted to see something. I actually don't even really care what comes in that request. I just wanted to know that it would work, that I could actually hit it. So that's the reason that I set this up initially, and this is all you really have to do. Inside of each one, this is the one for Alexa, I would return an object to the server, I can even talk right now. I would return a response object to Amazon, and this is all the JSON it needed. It just needed a version, needed to know if there's any special attributes it needed to look at, and what does it say as an output speech? And remember that visual I talked about? That's what a card is. The last one is probably one of the most important things you guys need to pay attention to, and that is should end session. That means whether or not this should continue to listen to the user, or if you just give information and you're done. Okay? This is even less JSON for Google Assistant. Okay? You can put this and plug this into one of your skills and it works immediately. That's pretty cool. Now, it's not sophisticated, it's not this really big architecture, but I just needed to know what the bare minimum was required. And then, this is kind of what it looked like for me to start testing it. You can type or you can speak. I prefer typing because people often on planes with Wi-Fi don't like it when I'm just constantly talking, and so it's much better for me to respond. And this is kind of what the response would be if you were to get it back for Alexa. And this is what it would look like to type it in on the top for Google Assistant. So you guys are following me pretty well, right? And this just updates it every time you put it in, because remember, Actions is connected to Google Assistant and then opens it up in a new window. So every time I would test this device, there's like an extra step for Google. But it isn't too bad once you get the hang of it. That brings me to dynamic user input, right? Can it take it? The answer is yes. It took a while for it to come around, but now we have an entity called a search query, at least the concept of one in Alexa, that allows it to be open-ended. So I don't really know what your favorite toy is. I might know a list of all the continents, and that might be a drop-down in my brain, a drop-down list or a list you can choose from, but I don't really know what your favorite childhood memory was. I don't know maybe how many years you've done something. So sometimes it's not practical for me to give you a predetermined list to choose from. And search query is an object type, a return type that you can use for this. By default, Google does it anyway. Everything inherits from just a basic object that allows the user to say whatever they need to say. And then optionally gives you an ability to declare the type, just like a data type. It could be an integer, it could be a predetermined list of things that they choose from. But Google already does it by default. So that means you can have much more open conversations. And that has taken a couple of years to come out. So I'm really excited that it's starting to take off. And where that comes in is like a custom slot. So now there's all these terms I'm throwing at you, and I promise it's not too bad. Basically what I mean by this is over here. So if you were to create some sort of intent about getting a horoscope, you have your sample utterance, okay, which is give me the horoscope for, and then you have a slot that the user fills out. That's what I mean by that dynamic user input. This right here doesn't need to be dynamic because there are only so many horoscope signs, right? So you can already fill that out. This is really helpful, though, for things like, I don't know, a Jedi mind trick skill, because I thought that would be a fun thing to demo for you, right? I wanted to see if I could do some sort of wildcard input. So this is kind of what it would look like to fill it out inside of the portal. That's how you'd fill out a slot. Do you have any questions, Joe? Yes? Okay, cool. And this is all the code that it took to make it. Now, I'm not using an SDK because this is just JSON. All I did was create a class as a plain old C# object, okay? That to make it easier to read and code, I just did it that way. I didn't have to, but I did. So this is all that mattered in order for me to create the kind of interaction that hopefully, as long as the Wi-Fi works, I'll be able to test for you, right? This is all that I needed to do for that. So, Alexa, start Jedi Master.
I'm ready to become a Jedi like you.
Say hello, DevConf.
Hello, DevConf.
Cancel.
May the Force be with you.
So if you notice, it is open to interpretation by the NLP engine that it has. But that's still pretty cool. I had an entire, tell it these are not the doors you were looking for. None of this was scripted. None of that was scripted. Because if you notice, all I'm doing is taking whatever the user said and feeding it right back. That's all I'm doing. Pretty cool. And that opened up all sorts of things for storytelling and different things that I could do for our users, especially when it comes to feedback. So whenever you are wanting to solicit feedback from a user after you've given them a service, oftentimes you'll give them a survey that they'll ignore, right? Or you will ask them to fill out some sort of a form in the process of a website. But for voice, unless you do a back and forth prompt, that's a long feedback cycle. Wouldn't it be great if you could just say, hey, in a sentence, tell us how we did today? And the user could just say, I thought it was pretty cool, thanks for doing this. And you literally capture what the user said, and you get that back. That's awesome. That means the user didn't have to pick from a predetermined list of yes or no answers. You also get the personality of the user, too. But, of course, as you heard there, it wasn't exactly sure what DevConf was, so it matched this closest thing, which is some name Dave, and then Con is what she thought, right? So sometimes it's not perfect, but it is absolutely a step in the right direction. All right, so I'll get that. Let's see if I can go to the expression so we have enough time for this. Okay, expression. Expressiveness is one of my favorite kinds of topics. I love bringing this up. Has anybody heard of speech synthesis markup language? No? Yes? Okay, a couple people. SSML is the HTML of the voice. It's the CSS of the voice, right? This is where all your front-end developers can spend their time, right? Because there isn't necessarily a visual cue, but you can do all sorts of things to massage the way that these voices sound. I can add pauses. I can drop the tone way down or way up. Each one of these platforms has their own SSML speech cons that allow them to do kind of quirky things. For example, on Google, you can have what is called a broken record that will repeat a couple times. And on Alexa, she'll whisper, very creepy. Right? So you can do all sorts of fun things. You can break it into the right way to pronounce something. It's awesome. If you're interested in the specs for that, it's actually been out for a while on w3.org for about 12 years. So that's the link to that, and I'll put it up in my slide deck at the end. So what it looks like for Google Assistant is pretty simple. When I was building my Jedi skill, I decided that I wanted to make Google the male bad guy. So I just decided that I was going to lower the pitch and slow the rate of speed down and put brakes in certain places. And so this is kind of what that would look like in the response that I was sending through that .NET service. And then it would look like this for Alexa. Alexa has an additional field you need to fill out that tells it whether or not you just want a plain text response or a special SSML response. All right, this is my favorite part of this demo. I hope you like it. Uh-oh. I forgot to unplug those. Let me start that over. Go back. All right, almost got it, maybe. I'm going to put this right on the edge. There are just not enough, jacks for everything to go around. All right, let's try that again.
Do you understand now? Alexa, tell Jedi Master to challenge me.
You didn't fail, Kylo. Kylo failed you. I won't. Challenge me.
You need a teacher. I could show you the ways of the Force. Come with me, Alexa. To the dark side.
Get out of my head.
So that was fed from the exact same application. I could have switched the roles, and that's pretty fun. Yeah, just for fun, I decided to make sure that they prompted each other with names so that you could keep the conversation going. But I loved that they shared context. They shared context because I pulled the context out of the individual ecosystems and I managed them. And I did that like this. Alexa has kind of a session attributes option that allowed me to save a key value pair of whatever the last intent was, so I knew where we were in the conversation. And context out is a section of the JSON for Google Assistant that allows you to also save the same kind of key value pair in those parameters right there. So it was really fun to go, what happens if we're out of order or anything like that? I was able to keep track in a database of which ones had been fulfilled so that I could pick the next response. And over time, that actually can become a randomized conversation. And I hooked up eventually other things to it to make it even more fun. So the question is, can I have these responses be updated by people who are not me? Of course. There is something in the world called content management systems, right? These are awesome. The first one I used was Drupal just because it was a headless CMS and it was easy for me to hook up to a REST service. There's also other great ones like Firebase and Backendless or AWS. Or if you're feeling feisty, you can roll your own, right? This has single-handedly changed the way that our clients have been able to interact with this. They were able to very swiftly make changes that we don't have to do directly in code. Now, while you saw me just give like a hard-coded response as an example, clearly I can just pull that out of a CMS or a database somewhere else. So can I change those responses based on my user's input? Absolutely. If you want to, you can add your own analysis on top of that. This is Watson's Tone Analyzer API. Watson's been around for a long time, but what we utilized it for was giving me an idea of how the user sounded. Now, I don't really get the actual tone from them because this is done in text form, so this is a text analysis. Okay? It told me whether or not whatever the user said was happy, sad, polite, and it gave me a confidence score of that, and it allowed me to, for instance, if I got back a certain score that indicates the user is sad or polite, I could give a different response based on that confidence. Okay? Right there. Or if you liked working with Microsoft services, Azure has a text analytics API that does much the same thing. This is the kind of response that I would give to it. The difference is I don't get a nice, neat little sad, polite, happy thing, but I do get to have a score that is kind of on that spectrum. Okay, so based on that score, I can still give a response that is more meaningful in that scenario. Right? So does every response have to be scripted? Well, initially, yes, but ultimately, no, right? There's way too much that I could go into for here, but this is a perfect application of machine learning and deep learning. Because once you start having a conversation with a user, you can start storing those and sending those in to machine learning algorithms that either already exist or ones that you build, and then that can be done and generated on the fly. So now it's starting to sound really exciting. Like now I can do all these things. So what should we keep in mind as we continue forward? This is a good kind of little pie chart of developer tips that I put together for you, right? Accessibility is probably one of the biggest factors. Now we talk about accessibility a lot in websites, but it's different with voice because sometimes a user will use these and have no hearing. Isn't that kind of strange that somebody who is hard of hearing or completely deaf would actually utilize a voice service, but they do. And that's why those cards that you can create as responses become really helpful. Or perhaps you create a website that has a WebSocket to your service that also updates a screen at the same time she speaks a response or he speaks a response. Okay? There's a lot of options. So just remember that when these ecosystems, when each one of these platforms are testing your skill before it gets published, the first thing they're going to test is whether or not this is valuable for somebody with sight, without sight. Okay? Remember that there's a huge beta community of people that are very helpful right now. The voice community is probably one of the most uplifting I've been in a long time. And these were all kind of examples of things that you need to keep in mind. You know, utilize a fall-through intent. Because if you don't know what the user's going to say because there's no menu in front of them, have something by default that you at least say. Say, hey, I don't really get that, but here's a list of things you can do. Or, hey, maybe try that again. And what's great about a fall-through intent is that you can store what they say so that you can make a list of things that you probably need to start supporting, which is something, by the way, you don't get on a website. That's pretty cool. If you're interested in some additional resources of how to really make your voice app shine, I've got a couple of different sites for you to go to. There's a great SSML blog if you want to play around with all sorts of different vocalizations. If you're interested in sequencing your intents in a certain order or maybe out of order to make and build a story or some sort of workflow from beginning to end, there's a great blog from FreeBusy on that. If you're interested in an additional fully fleshed out skill that I have made, but unfortunately not published for copyright reasons, I also created a Star Trek skill that is based around the ship's computer called LCARS. And so that's out on my GitHub if you'd like to play around with it. It's very fun, and it gives you examples of each different kind of intent that you can respond with. And then lastly, remember we talked about what is important, those 4 maxims, right? There's a great link to James Giangola talking about it, and I highly suggest that you hit that up before you start your skill. And without further ado, unless there's any questions, that's all I've got for today. So make sure that over the weekend, or, the next week showing up, just give this an hour or 2. You should be able to build a skill in an hour or 2. It's very fun to do, and tweet at me once you've got something up and running so I can see what you got. Thank you very much.